Okay. We're going to move on to our second speaker of the day. We're already running late, and it's only 9:40. I'm David Raxon. I'm a member of the psychology department, and it's my honor and privilege to introduce Professor Nathan A. Fox, who is a university professor in the Department of Human Development at the University of Maryland, College Park. Professor Fox conducts research on the biological basis of social and emotional behavior with a stress, pun intended I suppose, on behavioral inhibition, temperament, for which he's published what is the definitive meta-analysis, and neglect, which we're going to hear a lot about today. He has developed multiple methods for assessing brain activity in infants and young children, which is no mean feat, and they are designed to elicit a range of emotions. He's been funded by a plethora of institutes, including NIH, from whom he received the Merit Award for Excellence in Research. He, along with Professor Nelson, is a principal investigator on the Bucharest Early Intervention Project. He's pretty much a star in every way you can think about it. He's edited 5 books. Just like Marlene said that you can't count Chuck's articles, I literally tried to count Professor Nathan Fox's articles and I couldn't, but he has over 30,000 citations. He has an H factor of 100, which means he has 100 articles that have been cited at least 100 times, which is also an outstanding number for any academic. And he's been working on many of the issues that we're discussing today, and I do encourage you to go to the website that Professor Nelson pointed you to, which is the Scientific Council on the Developing Child. It's a wonderful resource, and in many ways they have already talked about some of the things we're talking about today. So today he's going to talk about the importance of sensitive period, he's going to, unfortunately Professor Nelson stole his line, which is timing is everything. I guess in this case timing was everything. So please welcome Professor Nathan Fox.
Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So first, yes, it is true. Going after Chuck, he'll always steal my best lines. But we've been doing this for close to 40 years. So sometimes I go first. First, let me thank David and Marlene and the organizing committee and the Heinz Foundation. I appreciate the invitation. It's really a privilege to be here this morning. I'm going to actually take a bit of a deeper dive into the issue of what Chuck called critical periods. I'm going to be calling them sensitive periods. There's a debate in the neuroscience literature about whether or not there's a difference between sensitive and critical periods, basically having to do with the width of the window that remains open during which experience may have an impact. I'm going to refer to them all as sensitive periods, but I'm going to give you a little bit of history about what we know about sensitive periods and brain development. And then I'm going to use a study that Chuck and I have been involved in now for almost 18 years, in which we have looked at the effects of early adversity, particularly neglect, and we have asked questions about different domains of development, both neural development and psychological development, and asked whether or not early adverse experience has a profound effect in terms of the development of the competencies in these domains. And I'm going to talk a little bit about intervention, because it's important to think about whether or not early interventions of a particular type have an effect upon these early adverse experiences, and whether or not the timing of the intervention, that is the child's experience of that intervention, really does matter. So let me just start with a general overview. This is sort of what Chuck has already told you about. So this really comes from the work that he and I have been involved in with Jack Shonkoff at the National Scientific Council for the Developing Child. We have 3 core concepts of development that we have articulated over the years. years. The first, as Chuck has nicely laid out for you in the first part of his talk, is that brain architecture is established early in life, and it supports lifelong learning. The second, which he spent a little bit less time on, and I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this morning, is that stable, caring relationships, what we have called serve and return, the interaction between caregivers and an infant, help shape brain architecture. And actually, this is a very important part of the intervention that I'll be telling you about that we've completed in Romania. And the third, that Chuck did spend some time on, and I won't this morning, is that toxic stress in the early years of life can derail healthy development. And he's giving you some examples of how that may in fact be the case. Okay, so first, the idea that brain architecture supports lifelong learning, behavior, and health. The idea is that brains are built over time, starting very early in life, that early skills beget more complex skills on top of them. It's one of the important aspects. And the second aspect is that cognitive, emotional, and social capabilities are all inextricably intertwined throughout the life course. When I was a graduate student, I was 10 when I started many years ago. Joke. Emotions and emotional development were not an area of study. It was really all about cognition and the cognitive revolution, and the idea that somehow affect and emotions and the emotional state would be intertwined with cognition and cognitive development was really not something that was addressed. Now I think that's really no longer the case, and it's seen as sort of old history. But the final message is that a strong foundation in the early years improves the odds of a positive outcome, and a weak foundation early in life makes the odds for later difficulties. And now I think I'm going to show the only slide that we have together. There it is. So you just remember it, and it's I guess Chuck said it's all over after 30. I'd like to say that, well, you know, if you're on the blue line, you just need to work harder you know, as you get older. That's sort of my more optimistic message of that. But the real issue here is to really look on this side of the figure, because it's most important to know that plasticity in learning and experience is greatest in the early years of life. That's really the message here. The other image that Chuck showed you here is that the timing in which neural circuits are wired goes in a bottom-up sequence. The first circuits that really come online are in the sensory pathways: vision, audition, touch, and then the ones for language. And then finally, you can see the prolonged period of time during which higher cognitive function, those circuits emerge over time. And you can see here what's going on really in the first year of life. A good way to illustrate this, and when I give in my undergraduate course a lecture about this, a good way to think about this is, well, how does neural development occur over these early years of life? And so here's a slice, cortex at birth, and you can see the neurons and with their axons and the synapses that are there. And now, if you look 5 years later, there's a dramatic difference in terms of the density of synapses in the cortex, in this area of cortex. Right? We used to call it the ocular subjective method, right? You just have to look at the image and you can see this dramatic change. And now if you go 8 years later in that same brain area, right, there's been pruning. Neuroscientists like to think of themselves somewhat as gardeners, so they use terms like blooming and pruning. And so you have the blooming of synapses in the first years of life, and the pruning of those synapses as the circuits become solidified over time, right? You can think of it as training wheels that are set up for a child to learn how to ride a bicycle, and once those training wheels are no longer necessary, they're removed, and the circuits that are involved in knowing how to ride a bike those are the ones that remain. Okay, so what do we mean when we talk about sensitive periods? This is a text from a wonderful paper by a neurobiologist by the name of Eric Knudsen. It was a paper in the Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience, I think in 2002. And what Eric said is that he defines sensitive periods as time-limited periods during which the effect of experience on the brain is particularly strong. And that these sensitive periods allow experience to instruct the neural circuits to process information in an adaptive way. Once that has happened, and they provide this initial information that is adaptive for development, they may in fact alter performance permanently. And up until very recently, when we thought about either critical or sensitive periods, we thought about them as having a window during which the sensitive period or critical period was open, and then after a particular period of time, it's shut. And as Chuck hinted in his talk, that may no longer be the case, and I'll mention that very briefly. But basically, our idea in neuroscience is that there's an open window, it alters brain circuitry, assuming normal, typical adaptive experience, and then it closes. Okay, where do these ideas about sensitive periods come from? Well, actually, it's quite interesting. Ethology was the first to sort of mention this notion of timing of a critical period. That's Konrad Lorenz, for those of you who don't recognize the famous picture of him and his baby ducklings. And his notion was that when the baby duckling hatched, the baby duckling would follow whoever the baby duckling saw first in terms of movement. And there was a time, there was a critical period during which the baby duckling had to see something or somebody moving in order for the baby duckling, in Lorenz's words, to be imprinted onto the mother duck, or in this case, onto Konrad Lorenz himself. There's a wonderful film that you can see of Lorenz swimming in the river and all the baby ducklings swimming around him, which is quite amazing. But, I mean, this idea of sensitive periods or critical periods is really from ethology in terms of behavior, observation of behavior, and the idea that there is this period of time when experience plays this important role. Really, in terms of neuroscience, the important study was by Ubel and Wiesel in the 60s, where they deprived kittens of certain types of visual experience, and they found that as a function of the timing of visual experience, that is, at what age after birth they deprived the baby kitten in one eye, let's say, or raised in the dark of particular kinds of visual experience, it would have a significant effect upon the development of that area in the brain that supports visual perception. It's called striate cortex. It's one of the areas of the brain. And you can see it's called striate cortex because it's striated like that. And you can see the effect of monocular deprivation in early infancy, leading to these deficits in brain organization. Ubel and Wiesel won the Nobel Prize for this work. They did it in kittens, they did it in non-human primates. And they really showed quite elegantly the effects of timing, the effects of different types of aberrant early experience on the development of the visual system. A developmental psychologist by the name of Daphne Maurer, who's at McMaster University, had what I think is really the brilliant idea she heard of a group of babies that were born with bilateral cataracts. And so they were deprived of pattern visual information. And back when Daphne started finding these babies, what she found out was that the age at which the neuro-ophthalmologists would remove the cataracts varied in terms of the skill, in terms of the recommendations that were available at the time. And so she reasoned, well, what she could do is she can follow up on these infants and see whether or not there's an effect of the timing of the age at which they got the cataracts removed. And in fact, she did. She found that different aspects of visual attention were affected by the age at which the cataracts were removed, with the cataracts being removed later having more problems in certain areas of visual perception. In fact, she has a wonderful paper, it's called Sleeper Effects, in which she found that early experience, that is the lack of this pattern visual information, establishes a neural substrate for capabilities that only emerge later in life. Not only capabilities that are there in the first years of life, but this was a test of face perception that you really could, only comes online, if you will, in early adolescence. And what Daphne found is that 14 years later, children whose cataracts were removed late in infancy were deficient in face processing. There's lots of evidence in the neuroscience literature on sensitive periods. That's Eric Knudsen, who I mentioned earlier. Eric studies barn owls, and he's interested in the experience that barn owls have, both in terms of their auditory and visual experience, because they have to integrate auditory and visual information in an area of the brain that he's identified called the optic tectum. And it's very finely tuned so that the auditory and visual information come together to provide the barn owl with the ability to swoop down and to capture its prey. And what Knudsen has done is he's manipulated, I love this picture, he's manipulated visual experience or auditory experience. He puts prisms on the baby barn owls to manipulate their visual experience in order to see whether or not it would move the area in which that integration occurred in this area of the barn owl's brain called the optic tectum, and in fact it does. Here's another some more recent work. This is a sensitive period for language in the visual cortex. Some of you may know this work. It's Maria Bedney, who's at Johns Hopkins, and she studies people, adults who are blind since birth, and she plays them language in the fMRI scanner. And what she finds is that in addition to those areas of the brain that light up for all of us who are sighted when we hear language, in people who are blind since birth, their visual cortex, the back of the brain, that area that is responsible for vision, it also lights up. So people blind from birth hear language in their visual cortex, right there. Whoops. And she's actually also done some work with the timing of blindness in terms of this particular finding. And the last piece of data that I want to tell you about is from Janet Worker, who's at University of British Columbia. Janet has studied the effects of hearing language, both your own language and other languages. And what she talks about is the perceptual narrowing, the narrowing of a window during which time infants can discriminate not only their own language, but other languages from around the world. And she finds that 9-month-old infants are able to discriminate across multiple languages. But by 12, 13 months of age, that ability seems to disappear. Now, it doesn't disappear if an infant hears more than one language, but it does disappear, particularly for those two languages, but it does disappear for infants who are monolingual in terms of their auditory experience. So that's what in Janet's work. But Janet had published some years ago a wonderful paper in which she argued, and I think this is really an important point to make about sensitive periods, is that for any domain, there are probably multiple sensitive periods. So if you unpack language into phonetic, phonological, lexical, semantic, or reading and spelling, there are probably sensitive periods during which experience is going to be playing a particularly important role. So it's not just one window, even for language, but probably multiple windows across development during which the types of experience really are going to matter. And Chuck showed you that graph from that study many years ago in which children were exposed from different families with different backgrounds. Children were exposed to different levels of language, numbers of words. You can see sort of the differences in terms of the effect of that exposure on their developing behavior. Okay. The last point is what Chuck briefly mentioned. This is the science fiction of the talk. That's Takao Hench, who is at Harvard Medical School. And Takao asked the question, can we reopen sensitive periods in the visual system? He works with the mouse, and he's interested in knowing whether or not that sensitive period that I told you about, and that Hubel and Wiesel described in their work, whether or not it's possible to reopen it. And the answer appears to be yes. Using his skill as a molecular biologist, he has shown that it is possible to reopen what appeared to have been a closed sensitive period in the visual system. And whether or not that will be true in other systems is really the work of science fiction right now. But it does say that we're beginning to understand the molecular biology of these sensitive periods, how they work in terms of opening up, how they work in general, the breaks in terms of closing, and how we may in fact reopen them. But our general conclusion about sensitive periods is that we know something about sensitive periods, even in human development, for perception and sensation, and for language. And as Chuck mentioned, we know that the brain expects a certain type of input at particular times of development. But what is not clear for many of us who study more complex cognitive or social behaviors, it's not clear whether or not experience continues to be associated with these sensitive periods, or whether or not it's really just the accumulation of sensitive periods at any time after these sensitive periods have closed. And the only way that we have known about that up until now is through intervention studies that suggest an advantage for early experience, but really they're correlational in nature. Now I want to say one more thing with regard to the talk that I'm giving today, and that is that I'm really going to be focusing, as I mentioned, on the area of neglect in terms of the work that I'm going to be telling. But neglect is important. If you look at this graph here, you'll see that in terms of child maltreatment, it is the most prevalent form of child maltreatment. Now, the interesting thing about neglect is that it's not the presence of physical abuse or sexual abuse, right? It is the absence of. It is the absence of certain expected experiences. I mentioned earlier, serve and return, interacting with a caregiver, that is really characterizing neglect. So if you ask, why is neglect bad for the brain? Well, if the brain expects input it doesn't receive, you've already heard that the wiring may be altered. And this is particularly egregious, I would argue, if experience is expected to occur during a sensitive period failed to occur. Much like you saw the examples of vision with the kittens or with Daphne Maurer's infants who have the bilateral cataracts. And so what happens to a child when he or she is deprived of most expected experiences during a sensitive period of development is really what this is all about. Okay, here's my project that I'm going to be telling you about. This is, the person there is Nicolae Ceausescu. He was the communist dictator of Romania, and he believed that the way to make Romania prosper was to increase the population. And you can see all the things on this slide that he did in order to make sure that that would happen. He outlawed contraception and abortion. He established a tax on families that had fewer than 5 children. He rewarded families for having more children. He had gynecologists from the state going around checking whether women were pregnant or not. And he believed that he would increase the population, which he did. The problem is that with this large number of infants being born to very poor families, the policies became one of child abandonment, because families could not afford to keep their children. And what Ceausescu did is he set up a network of institutions all around the country, and families were told that they could leave their infant at the maternity wing, that their infant would be placed into one of these institutions, and that when they were ready, that is, when they were economically able to take the child back, they could come back and pick the child up. Now, in the majority of cases, that did not happen. But we often think about these institutions as orphanages, but orphanages are really places where the parents are no longer alive. And about 60% of the infants and young children that were living in institutions in Romania, both of their biological parents are still alive. And in many cases, they had not given up the legal rights for that child. So in December of 1989, Ceausescu was overthrown. There were over 100,000 infants and young children who were living in these state institutions. As I mentioned to you, poverty was really the #1 reason for this abandonment. Some of you may be as old as I and remember back in January, February of 1990 when the US media, 2020, they broadcast videos of the conditions in which these infants and young children were living. And people from the United States, from the United Kingdom, from Canada, flew off to Romania to go and adopt infants and young children that were living there. In many instances, these families that were doing that were unprepared for the kinds of behavior abnormalities that these children would present with. And for various reasons that I won't really go into right now, but having to do with corruption and pressure from the European Union at the time, Romania decided to ban international adoption. And so the children that remained, the infants and children that remained in these institutions, had nowhere to go. To give you a sense about what the institution is like, I have some pictures there. You can see on the bottom right what the baby ward was like. The institution is characterized by regularity. All the infants were fed at the same time, had to go to the potty at the same time. They were dressed and their hair was cut so you really couldn't tell whether it was a girl or a boy. And they were fed, but there was virtually no interaction, social interaction, serve and return that I mentioned to you earlier as being so important for the early brain development. Now I have a short video that we took. And it's in an institution where we ultimately worked. couple of things that I'd like you to pay attention to. One is that you might notice the stereotypies. That's the rocking back and forth that the infants are doing. The second thing is, for those of you who have ever, and we do this in my lab all the time, coded infant and toddler social behavior. We have a code that we call aimless wandering. That is just wandering around. If you go into a daycare center or a preschool in the United States, you wouldn't see kids that were not playing with each other, not interacting with each other, but yet that's what you saw, and the absence of any interaction amongst the kids in the institution. Okay, so that was what that was the environment, the context in which we found ourselves. And here's the study that we did. There were 6 sectors that the communists divided Bucharest, Romania into. Each sector had an institution. With the help of a pediatrician, Dana Johnson from the University of Minnesota, we screened all of the infants under the age of 2. And we had criteria. We did not want infants, to include infants in the study who had developmental disabilities or obvious frank fetal alcohol syndrome. And we assessed those infants and young children. We built a laboratory in one of the institutions, brought over all the computers and amplifiers and cameras and things like that, and set it up, screened and assessed all of these infants. And then once that assessment was done, we randomized those infants and young children so that half of them remained exactly where they were. We didn't randomize children to go into an institution. They were living in the institution at the time. But we did take half of the children out, and we placed them into families that we had recruited. We also had a group of children from typical Romanian families as our control group, really just to see that our measures were working correctly. Now, I do want to say something about the intervention because it's important for the work. This was, we call it foster care, but it was really the Cadillac of foster care, or maybe the Lexus or the Maserati. We trained social workers. We supervised visits between the family and the biological family, if the biological family was there. And we worked very closely with these foster families. In fact, they were visited every 10 days. There was intensive phone contact. We gave them educational support. There were support groups. And all of this continued until the child was 54 months of age. So our support for each family began at that point of randomization and ended when a child became 54 months of age, because not every child was the same age when they went into the intervention. They ranged in age from around 6 months all the way up to around 29 months of age when they first went into the intervention or were randomized to remain in the institution. And here's more you see through our phone calls and consultation. We had a wide range of measures that we assessed. Everything from physical development all the way down to social competence and psychopathology. And obviously I'm not going to have the time to talk to you about such a wide range of measures. I'm happy to answer any questions about any of these other domains that I'm not covering, or even for the ones that I am covering today. But you can see that there was an intensive assessment of these infants and children, and it was done at this baseline period before randomization, and then at 30, 42, 54 months, and then at age 7, 8, and then at age 12, and we're fortunate enough to have support from the NIH to now see these children at age 15 and 16. The hypotheses should be pretty clear. We believe that institutional rearing would have a profound effect upon children's socio-emotional development, at least. and that removing a child and placing them into a family will remediate some of these deficits. And for the purposes of this talk, we're interested in timing of age of placement into the intervention. Now, obviously, age of placement is hopelessly correlated with the length of time that they're in the intervention, and also with the length of time that they've been in adversity. So we try to partial out those factors to look specifically at timing of placement as an important aspect in terms of the sensitive periods. Okay, so let me go through some data with you now. The first is language. We were obviously interested in language development of the infants and children. We use something called the Raynell scales of receptive and expressive language development. And what we found, the 0 line is the standard of what you consider to be typical for this particular age. And the gray bar is expressive language. The red bar is receptive language. And what you see here, these are the infants that were randomized to remain in the institution. You can see that they're significantly delayed in both receptive and expressive language. And now if you go all the way over to this side, if you were a child that was placed into a family before the age of 15 months, you looked just like a typical Romanian child, right? That was also sort of the case for 16, if you were taken out before 16 months. But then there's a drop, you see. So that if you're taken out after, after 24 months, 29 months, then your language skills are significantly impaired. And that's true not only with the Raynell scales, but it's also true when we did a language sample to look at mean length of utterance. You can see here, these are the community controls, and here are the children that are taken out before 24 months of age. They're indistinguishable from the community controls, but if you're taken out after 24 months of age, you look just like the children that were randomized to remain in the institution. The next area is really IQ. We use something called the Bailey scales of mental development. Those of you who have assessed infants and young children will be familiar with that. It's normed at 100 with a standard deviation of 15. And the green bar are the community controls, and so they're right at the norm for children this age, infants and toddlers this age. But you can see that the mean of the infants and toddlers who are at that time living in the institution is 64, suggesting that they are significantly and severely developmentally delayed on these Bailey scales of mental development. So now I'm going to ask two questions. Is there an effect of intervention as we follow these children longitudinally, prospectively? And I'm also going to see whether or not there's an effect of timing of the placement of the child into a family. Okay, so here's the first answer to the first question up through 54 months of age. The red bar are the children who were randomized to the foster care. The yellow bar are the children who were randomized to care as usual, to remain in the institution. By the way, all of these analyses are what we call intent to treat, which means that even if a child had left the institution, or even if a child had left the foster family, we still treat them, as we do these analyses, as if they continue to remain in that placement that they were randomized to. So it's a fairly conservative analysis. And so what you can see here is that there is an intervention effect. And now if I ask the second question, is there a timing effect? The answer is yes. You can see here we did cutoffs. These are the infants and toddlers taken out before 18 months of age, taken out between 18 and 24 months of age, and over 24 months of age. And there's a sharp drop in terms of their IQ scores. If they're taken out before 24 months of age, their IQs look pretty normal. If they are taken out after 24 months of age, the answer is no. Remarkably, we've just published these data in the journal Developmental Psychology, and I just wanted to show you that 10 years later, after the beginning of the study, when the kids were 12, we continue to find an intervention effect. There's no timing effect anymore, but there is an intervention effect with the children who were randomized to foster care having higher IQ scores than the children who were randomized to remain in the institution. And I will say this is intent to treat, and most of the children are not living in the institution anymore. So early in childhood, we found that infants 24 months or younger removed from adversity and placed into families had higher IQ scores. The sensitive period that I showed you earlier did not remain when the children were 8 and 12 years of age. But what I didn't show you but need to tell you is that the infants who are in our intervention, who remained in the intervention over this period of time, they did the best. So if you had a stable placement in a family over this period of time, you did better than if you were taken out, placed into a family, and then went somewhere else. So stability of placement, number of disruption was also an important factor. Okay, attachment. We all know, we all thought that the ability to form a significant relationship with someone else was going to be an important aspect of our study. And so we did something that was developed by Mary Ainsworth, who was at the Johns Hopkins and University of Virginia many years ago, called the strain situation. Just to let you know that what it is we videotape the infant or the child with, you're supposed to videotape them with their primary caregiver and then with a stranger, and you're supposed to see whether or not the infant, when they are distressed, seek the proximity and contact of their primary caregiver. Now you might ask yourself, who were the primary caregivers for the infants that were living in the institutions? And the answer is we did that by committee. We gathered all of the caregivers in a particular institution and we said, okay, child number 1, who is this child's favorite caregiver? And they would say, oh yeah, it's this person. So that was our primary caregiver for this child, okay? That's how we did it. When we classified these children, we found that the majority of the children in the institution had very disorganized attachment classifications. But the people who did the classification were people who were trained in strain situation coding from the University of Minnesota, and they said that they had never seen behavior like this before. And so they suggested that we set up a scale where 5 is anything that they've ever seen before in the strain situation, 1 through 4 are anomalous behavior. And here's what the data look like when you do that. What you see is that 100% of the community controls have typical behavior, but only 3% of the children who are living in institutions, this is before randomization, before they're put into the intervention, only 3% are showing any kind of typical behavior. All right, so now, is there an intervention effect? And the answer is there appears to be. At 42 months of age, the kids in foster care are doing better. There's less insecurity in terms of their attachment behavior. And so the intervention does work. But then the question for this talk is there a timing effect? And the answer here again is yes. If you look at these cut points again, this is the age at which they're taken out of the institution and placed into foster care. If you're a child that's taken out before 24 months of age, the probability of you showing a secure attachment, of you being able to form a relationship with an adult caregiver is very high. If you're taken out afterwards, it decreases significantly. Okay, and that just says that. I want to talk a little bit about the brain. As I mentioned, we looked at brain activity of the infants while they were still living in the institution. And one of the things that we found is that the amount of brain power, EEG, this is electroencephalography, and this is alpha rhythm power, and the red is is the typical pattern that you would expect to see. There's the community sample, and you could see there's almost a complete absence of it in the infants and toddlers who were at that time living in the institution. It was as if someone had taken a dimmer switch and turned it down so that the brain activity and power that these infants were emitting was so low. So now, is there an intervention effect and a timing effect? The answer, quite briefly, is yes. If you're a foster care child taken out before 24 months of age, you're indistinguishable from community controls. But if you're a foster care child who's taken out after 24 months of age, you're also indistinguishable from the children that were randomized to remain in the institution. And this is at 8 years of age, and it is intent to treat. Okay. A couple of, we also looked at competence at age 12. There's that list. We wanted to see who's a competent child and who isn't. So in terms of their mental health, their peer relationships, these are all things that we measured. And you can see here that a 7 or 6 or 7 is what our community controls were showing. If we look at whether there's an intervention effect, the answer is yes. These are, gray bars are not competent. Yellow bars are. These are the randomized to the institution. These are randomized to our intervention. So it's about 50% of our kids randomized, this is at age 12, randomized to go into our intervention are showing competent behavior. And if we ask what predicts that competence, yes, it is timing. So being placed before 20 months of age is associated with heightened competence. Okay, this is my final set of data for you this morning. We're interested in mechanism. How is it? What is it that may, in fact, Chuck mentioned toxic stress, but what are the mechanisms by which adversity, neglect, get under the skin? And we thought from the animal literature, from the neuroscience literature, that a good place to look was the stress system. And so what we did, because we know that early regulation of stress responses by caregivers may have lasting effects in terms of buffering the effects of stress. Remember, Chuck told you about positive stress, right? It's when it's buffered, when you have a stressful experience, but there's somebody there to buffer it, and that's what caregivers generally do. So we asked the question, how does early environment shape the autonomic nervous system and the HPA axis? That's the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. It's the system in the body that helps regulate stress with one of the hormones called cortisol. And what we did is we did what, many psychologists who study stress did. We stressed the kids out at age 12. We gave them something called the Trier stress test. They were told that they were going to have to prepare a speech. Then while they were giving the speech, we had somebody sitting in there with a white coat criticizing them. Then, I know, it's fair. But we did have IRB approval. And then we gave them a math task in which they had to count backwards while they were doing the math. And here's what we found. This is heart rate. Now, what you would expect, the dark bar are the community controls. And the community controls are showing the expected stress response. Their heart rate during the speech task increased. Their heart rate during the math task increased. But look at the care as usual. They showed a hypo response. They were not responding to this stress. And it's true about heart rate. It's true about blood pressure. It's true about sympathetic activity as well. All right? All of these autonomic measures of stress are showing that our care as usual kids, the ones randomized to care as usual, are not showing stress. They are hypo-responsive. Now, what's interesting, if you look at cortisol, the solid black line, that's the community kids. They're showing a typical cortisol response. But neither the group of foster care kids nor the kids randomized to the institution are showing a cortisol response. But wait, we asked the question whether timing matters, and the answer is yes. These are the two lines for the foster care children who were taken out before 24 months of age and that's the line for those taken out after 24 months of age. And I'm going to go backwards. That solid line, that's the community controls. That solid line, that's the kids taken out before 24 months of age. They're no different, right? They're showing the typical response. Okay, so the conclusions there is that deprivation seems to affect the stress system, and the assignment to high-quality family care mitigates this, and that earlier the assignment to family care, the better. So our behavioral findings are reduction in IQ. I didn't mention the fact that we get no intervention effects in executive function or in terms of psychopathology and ADHD. I'd be happy to discuss that if you want. But in other domains, many of them were tied to this cut point of around 24 months of age. And you can see sort of the list of the timing of placement effects that we have found in our research. Now, what is going on, and what do we think are the issues in terms of timing of placement? We think it has to do with caregiving and the fact that there is an absence of stimulation, social interaction, serve in return, holding, lack of responsiveness to distress, lack of reciprocal interaction that is going on in these institutions and in homes in which children find themselves in neglect. You might ask yourself, well, why is the NIH interested in supporting, we're thankful that they are, our research in Bucharest? And the reason is that we argue, I think somewhat persuasively, that the institution, although an extreme, is a model for neglect, which in the United States is the most pervasive form of maltreatment. Okay. So what we don't know, here's just a list of what we don't know. We don't know why some of these timing effects disappear. We don't know why some domains are unaffected by intervention. And also how broadly or narrowly these sensitive periods are. But we do see that there is a significant amount of plasticity, but there are also these sensitive periods for social and cognitive development that are a result of this early family intervention. Okay, these are those conclusions. And I haven't really talked about all of the brain data. I'd be happy to, but I think that what I tried to show to you is that our model of foster care, of family care really, appears to be effective to ameliorate the negative effects of neglect. I think that's really the message that I want to present to you today. And so with that, I will thank my two co-conspirators, Charlie Zena, who is at Tulane University, and Chuck, who you just heard from, and our sponsors, and thank you for your attention.
We're running a couple of minutes late, but we certainly have time for some questions. I'm going to go to Bob, who's my senior colleague. So I have to.
Hi, Bob.
Hey, Nathan. Wonderful talk. Really just stellar work. I'd like to ask you a question about an aspect of timing that you didn't talk about, but that I know about in this literature and that's always puzzled me. So in terms of the improvement of the children after they are in the foster homes, whether here in Romania or in Rutter's work in Great Britain, the kids catch up for a while on all kinds of different measures, linguistic, cognitive, social. But then it seems to level off at about age 5 or 6. And the data, at least through age 12 that I've seen, they're probably even more recent, older kid data, but I bet it's the same. It levels off, and they don't seem to benefit further in terms of catching up relative to the control group. And I've always found that puzzling, and I'm curious what your thoughts about why that's the case.
Yeah. It's an important question. I went through the data, IQ data, really quickly. If you look at the IQ data that I presented quickly at age 12, while we see an intervention effect, the mean IQ level for the foster care children is still significantly lower than community controls. In fact, I didn't put the community controls on that slide for just that very reason, because it would swamp them. I do think it's a combination of two things. One is we don't know, at least in our data, about genetic effects. I mean, who these kids are in terms of their family backgrounds, because in many of the cases, we don't have any of that literature, nor any of that data, nor do we know anything about prenatal exposure. So those are certainly two sources in our data that may be the case. The third thing is that, I've talked about 24 months as being a sensitive period in our data, but in part it is a function of the ages, the window of ages that we have. In Mike Rutter's data, infants that were placed below 6 months of age look perfectly fine. And I don't think that they show that decrease the way kids who are older than 6 months do in the ERA study. So I think that it's a combination of getting there early and also background that is ultimately affecting it. And one more thing, which is that the environments in which the kids remain, in many cases, at least in our data, are not similar. For example, in Mike's data, they are middle-class UK families, and it's not the same in our data at all. That said, these decreases that we've seen in our own data are there, and they're also in many other intervention studies as well. And there is that initial boost. And what we can say, and this is a long-winded answer, what we can say is that we continue to maintain positive outcomes in the social domain, but not so much in the cognitive domain.
Go to Brian, and then we'll come to you, sir.
Two wonderful talks. Both of you mentioned language, and I think you pointed out Janet Worker's notion of cascading sensitive periods, which is, I think, very helpful. But the tests that you're actually using with these kids are like the RANL and the MLU, and I really have a hard time pulling apart what is really where are there perhaps, well, Chuck says critical, you say sensitive periods in phonology. Even Janet, for example, and this whole research shows that there are many sounds of the world's languages that have no critical period at all, and yet some do. And so language is a really diverse area, and to just have one measure, I just don't think we're getting much of a picture about what's going on, actually.
You're right. There are some aspects of our study, some domains in our study that we have, because of our own backgrounds and expertise, that the measures that we have are sensitive to the kinds of issues that you're raising in terms of unpacking a very complex domain into its different parts. And there are other aspects, like language, in which we did not do as good a job in terms of that kind of unpacking. So no, I don't think that our language data, I did purposely show that slide of Janet's with the multiple sensitive periods, just to acknowledge the fact that if we really wanted to do a good job, we should be probing each of these sub-processes along the way. But we didn't, so I can't really address that.
And partly also there's, the idea that you might have hard problems, not just, lower vocabulary, but really stuttering, SLI, also real deficits that occur early on.
Yeah, I mean, I will.
It was more on Chuck's side, but.
Yeah, no, I will say that we've been careful in terms of characterizing the physical and motor deficits or performance of the children. So while that's certainly possible, I'm not 100%. I'm not really sure that that's it. But I don't think that we've probed, particularly as the children have gotten older, all of these subdomains in the way that you're suggesting should have. That's why I have a flat forehead. It's because I constantly.
So, Bob Chico, a neonatologist. I just have to make a comment about how good science translates into public policy. I've been fortunate enough to be in Romania from 1999 until 2015, helping them with perinatal services. In 1999, when you walked into any hospital, there were at least 20 to 25 babies in every hospital in what they called an abandoned baby ward that were ultimately destined to go to an institution. I think partly, and maybe in large part because of the work that you've done, they have completely changed their system. Most of those kids are being placed in foster homes. And when you go there in 2015, there are essentially 0 babies in that situation. So I think it's an example of how the work that has been done has allowed there to be public policy change that has changed the way that people deal with the number of abandoned babies in that situation.
Well, thank you. We made a conscious effort as the results of our study came in to alert the Romanian government to these findings. And we had some partners who were associated with the government who really worked very closely with us. And so, it's to the Romania's benefit that they have been able to move ahead in those years.
Okay, we're out of time, unfortunately, because we're already